Good evening and welcome to After Hours. Joining us this evening is Eleanor Boyle, and she's the author of High Stakes, Why and How to Eat Less Meat. Welcome to After Hours.
Thanks, Patrice. Delighted to be here.
So what started, you don't eat meat? Is that an assumption, or
Nope,
do you?
I do not eat meat.
So what started you on the path of making a change in your diet?
I had started to become aware quite a long time in my teens about some of the ways in which we can make value statements through what we eat. And I read a book by John Robbins years ago that turned a lot of people into vegetarians called Diet for a New America. And I decided that I wanted to stop eating meat. That was my position. Since then, that was a little more recently. That was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Since then, at first, I began to feel that everybody should be vegetarian. And as I read more about it and thought more about it and talked to more people about it, I began to moderate my position and develop more really empathy, which is something that I feel we all have to really have for each other when we're talking about making environmental changes. Not insist that either ourselves or others make extreme changes because they might not last. And I've come to feel that there's nothing wrong with livestock and there's nothing wrong with meat in moderation. A lot of it comes down, some of your listeners might be feeling that it's not moral for humans to eat animals when they have other choices. And that's a debate that goes on, and that's reasonable. People can disagree on that. But I'm going to assume that most people feel that it's ethically acceptable to eat some meat. I'm saying, fine. Let's just figure out how to do it in a way that is kind to the animals and sustainable for the planet.
Well, I've read that book as well. And I think initially what that book did for me was it sort of started as a health issue.
Yeah.
It was very much a health issue with hormones and that kind of thing. Then I went through very much the cruelty aspect of factory farms and slaughtering. And now I'm kind of at the point where it's like, well, if I can't actually kill this animal and do what I have to do to get the meat, I won't eat meat. Yeah. Talk a bit about that. Was it health for you at first, and what was the...
Well, as I began to read the literature, it seemed to me that there were three streams of reasons that researchers would discuss and that individuals would think about when they decided to eat less meat or to eat no meat. And one, as you say, is the animals. For a lot of people, especially young people, they don't want to see animals treated the way that they are in food production systems. So the animals, or the ethical side, if you like, some people would take it to say that it's a spiritual issue. Two, environment. There are a lot of environmental downsides, particularly of the ways that we produce meat today. And the third is health. Again, it's the amounts of meat that we eat, particularly from intensive production systems, which, as you say, have a lot of chemicals, have a lot of hormones, sometimes antibiotics, other chemicals that are really problematic for health. So ethics, environment, and health, all of those three are really valid reasons for people to at least cut back on their meat consumption.
Farms, old MacDonald's farm. In the past, farms, there were family. Talk a bit about farms and how that has changed and what factory farming really is.
I mean, people will say, in criticizing, if you like, my take on this, I'll say, hey, humans have always eaten animals. We're part of the natural world, and we have, for long human history, used animals for our purposes, including food. But that was, for much of human history, that was when animals were produced completely differently from how they are today. And as you say, family farms, old MacDonald's farm, as the children's story goes, is still the notion in a lot of people's heads as to how meat is produced, and it's just not. The vast majority of our meat is produced in intensive factories. A lot of people call it factory farming. Animals are crowded, to put it mildly. Thousands, tens of thousands of animals all in one building. And it's not only questionable, to put it mildly, as to whether this is right for us to be treating other species this way. But in fact, it also causes environmental problems because we get huge amounts of manure all in one place. So that the old notion that livestock manure is good fertilizer is true in small amounts, not in large amounts. And there are mountains of manure in many parts of our countrysides where factory farming is the norm. So ethically it's questionable, environmentally it's also questionable.
What do you think, like, I've had several discussions with people about this. You know, the fact that these animals are under high stress, don't have normal lives, and I have close contact with animals, so I know they are social, they make friends, they have families, you know. The fact that they're kind of insane, very stressed, and what do you think of the idea that if we're consuming that, we're also consuming that as well, the torture, the insanity,
I mean, at the very least, you make a very good point. At the very least, we have to ask whether it is acceptable on some level, any level, for us to treat animals that way. But purely from a medical or biological point of view, yes, we are consuming animals, if they were factory farmed, that were stressed. That is a very safe statement. Factory farm meat probably has measurable levels of stress hormones far above those of farm animals that were treated more naturally. And in fact,
and they're less healthy as well in the factory farm, I think.
In a whole variety of ways, absolutely. In fact, if you look on the website of the Canadian government agency that moderates, that okays the chemicals that are allowed to be used for animals, you'll see that there are a lot of chemicals that are allowed to be used in livestock simply for stress, believe it or not. So that it's absolutely accepted that the animals in these intensive systems are stressed. It can't be good for us, it's certainly not good for them.
So tell me we speak of the environment, who is Dr. Eva Pep?
Dr. Eva Pep is one of the many people I quote in the book who I had the pleasure to go and meet. She is a highly respected, I would say renowned biologist based in Winnipeg, and she is a water quality expert who has for years documented the effect of the intensive hog or pig industry in Manitoba on the health of Lake Winnipeg or the ill health of Lake Winnipeg and other water systems. And she has very conclusive evidence in highly respected, refereed academic articles showing that a lot of the problems in Lake Winnipeg and a lot of the pollution comes from intensive hog production.
Now when the industry hears that, or if government hears that, how are they reacting? How do people react? Especially people who might live in that area as well. So that's a big question, but.
A province like Manitoba is like a lot of other regions of North America and probably elsewhere in the world. There's a lot of conflict in rural areas about how meat should be produced. There's a lot of conflict. In fact, researchers have documented that intensive livestock operations, or confined animal feeding operations as they're called in the United States, coming into rural areas will raise the whole level of conflict in what often used to be a much more cohesive neighborhood and community. What do people say? Some of the farmers will support or defend, if you like, the intensive livestock operations, often because they feel that, hey, this is the way things are going, we have to get on board, my old family farm just isn't making it anymore, so I'm going to try to get a job in the new industry. Some of them will support it for that reason. What do governments and companies say? You know, I've come to have, as I said, a lot of empathy for everybody in this business. I no longer feel that there are any bad guys. So, for example, we have these meat contamination problems in Alberta that have happened in the last couple of months. I don't blame the companies. I don't actually blame anybody. I think there are no villains. I think we're all part of a system in which we've all come to expect meat at virtually every meal, certainly every day, and we've all come to expect it to be very inexpensive. So that we play a role in this as well, and I think that's kind of liberating because we can all do something to help contribute, and as I say in the book, without becoming vegetarian. For those who don't want to, there's no need. But once again, it's a question of amounts, cutting back, moderating our intake, understand that we don't need meat every day, and then being willing to do something really hard for a lot of people, pay more for meat that has been produced locally, sustainably, and kindly to the animals.
Elsie Herring.
Yes.
Tell me about her.
Elsie Herring is another one of the people I had the honor to interview. She is featured at the beginning of chapter 5, which is a chapter on sort of values and community integrity. A lot of community integrity, I think, is threatened by intensive livestock operations. She's an example of some of the many people living in the United States. She happens to live in North Carolina, which has a lot of intensive hog operation. She and her family lived in a particular lovely rural area for several generations, and an intensive hog barn went in right next door 25 years ago, I believe it was now, and her lifestyle has been massively impacted. She used to be able to sit outside and say hi to her neighbors. And again, there are lots of stories like this, she can't sit outside anymore. There's too much hog waste that she can smell, flying around in the air, gets on her laundry. And as I say in the book, it's no coincidence that she is African American, because where intensive livestock operations tend to go in is areas that are low income. And a lot of people like Elsie and her colleagues would say that it's because they don't have the political clout to fight back. But a lot of people, ordinary people, have been impacted negatively by the entry of intensive operations and really the takeover of the meat industry in some ways by these kinds of production systems.
So a couple of questions. Who owns these farms?
Who owns the intensive livestock
Yes.
operations? Well, one of the things that's happened in meat production, like other kinds of food production and like other kinds of commodity production or goods production, meat production used to be very diversified and decentralized, with lots of small farmers producing small amounts. As is the tendency in our economy, there's been more and more concentration in the hands of a few. I try not to mention specific corporations, but I will say, because again, I don't want to point fingers. I think we all support the system
yeah.
in which more and more of meat production is in the hands of fewer and fewer companies, and beef production, way over 50% of beef production is in the hands of, I believe it's 4 huge corporations, certainly in North America. There are fewer and fewer companies that are more and more massive and rely more and more on highly mechanized intensive production. That has a lot of trouble, shall we say, taking sustainability goals into account.
Now, when you say high intensity, what does that mean? First of all, we don't see the animals.
We don't see the animals.
They're enclosed.
You drive through the countryside. You drive through the countryside.
Where's that cow?
Very often you
Chickens.
don't see animals anymore in the countryside, and we go, where are they? Particularly when people are eating lots and lots of meat, they're in buildings.
How many? High intensity. How many animals are we talking about?
I'd have to look back at the precise numbers.
Approximately.
I believe it's 1,000 beef cattle, tens of thousands, I believe it's tens of thousands of pigs, and it can be as much as 50,000, as many as 50,000 chickens can all be housed in one building, definitely. There are systems in the United States, there are companies in the United States that have more chickens